Well, our first presentation this morning is by Dustin Smith, the professor of theological studies at Reformed University, where he teaches in the Bachelor of Arts and Theological Studies program, in addition to the Master of Divinity program. Dr. Smith has also taught several courses at Columbia Theological Seminary. He is the co-author of 2 books, including the AI Critical New Testament, a groundbreaking Bible project utilizing artificial intelligence to produce a translation of the New Testament that is completely free of denominational biases. He also co-authored Son of God, 3 Views of the Identity of Jesus. Dr. Smith is the host of the Biblical Unitarian podcast, a weekly show dedicated to exploring topics that deal with the oneness and unity of God and the humanity of Jesus. Dr. Smith's podcast just released episode 299. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Dustin Smith.
So my topic today is the incarnation of wisdom in pre-Christian Judaism, and there's a lot of data to go over in the presentation today. I understand that a title like this is probably something that you're not quite looking at and thinking, yeah, that's something I'm already convinced of. So I know I have an uphill battle with many of you, but I think that the data's there. I think that the data is there, and I think that this is really going to change the way that we come to appreciate the ways in which Jesus is portrayed as the embodiment of wisdom and, of course, the embodiment of the Word within the New Testament. So, what is the aim of today's presentation? The aim of this study is to ascertain to what extent the concept of incarnation appears in pre-Christian Jewish sources, okay? Now, it's very important when you are having conversations like this that you need to define your terms, okay? What do I mean by incarnation? There are many people that just think that incarnation is a terrible word and that we should not be using incarnation in regard to what is said in the Gospel of John. So my definition of incarnation, which is a noun, is the act wherein the preexisting word, or its close synonym wisdom, becomes flesh and lives on earth among the people. Okay, so there's a word that preexists, and wisdom is a close parallel to word, and it becomes flesh and it lives on earth among the people. So, the current scholarly assumption in regard to the Gospel of John is this. The theology of incarnation finds its origins specifically in John 1:14, where the pre-existing word, or wisdom, becomes flesh and pitches its tent among the Johannine community. This effectively sets a date for the theology of incarnation to roughly the end of the 1st century when the 4th gospel arrived at its final form. So this is the current scholarly assumption on the origins of incarnation. We just look at John 1:14, we date that text, that's when theology of incarnation begins. And so here are some quotes to make that particular point. This scholar, Dr. Scott, says that the Word became flesh is a step beyond anything said directly of Sophia in the tradition. Sophia is the Greek noun for wisdom. So he's making the argument that what is being said here in John 1:14 is beyond anything that's already said of the wisdom tradition. Our next scholar, who wrote 2 volumes of commentary on the Gospel of John, says the author of the hymn is now describing something that he did not derive from the old wisdom tradition. In other words, the prologue is doing something brand new. And then we can even look at Dr. Lincoln's commentary, who says that this formulation goes far beyond any personification of the divine wisdom to claim that this wisdom has become incarnate in a particular human. Notice, by the way, that these scholars already understand that wisdom is a parallel for word. It is a synonym for word. But this commentator is saying that this has gone far beyond anything that is ever said about wisdom becoming incarnate. So that's what scholars are saying on the Gospel of John. However, There are many scholars of the Second Temple Judaism, that have observed that the personified wisdom of God is portrayed as becoming human, becoming incarnate in the flesh of noteworthy individuals. So we got some scholars that say that incarnation begins in the Gospel of John, in John 1:14. We have some other scholars that say, no, it's actually there in pre-Christian Judaism, in Second Temple Judaism. Both scholars can't be right, okay? So our job today is to ascertain where it begins. So what are we going to be looking at in our study today? Well, the flow of the argument, we're going to start with the book of Proverbs. That's the earliest place to where personified wisdom appears in our literature. We're going to move to the book of Sirach, which is also called Ben Sira. Then we're going to move to a document that I imagine none of you have looked at before called the Genesis Apocryphon. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll move to the first century, looking at the writings of Philo, and then finally we will end at the prologue of John's Gospel. Buckle up, here we go. All right. Proverbs. Now, Proverbs chapters 1 through 9, obviously the first 9 chapters, and chapter 31, the final chapter, bookend the collection of Proverbs. And these chapters are the largest hub of personified wisdom texts that appear within the book of Proverbs. So most of the wisdom texts, personified wisdom texts, are going to be in these chapters. And scholars date the composition of these chapters, 1 through 9 and 31, to the Persian period, so around 400. So this is probably the earliest we can date personified wisdom text. So when you open the book of Proverbs, you start in chapter 1, you can see that wisdom is introduced in a fairly casual way. To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. So what is wisdom? Well, the parallel tells us that wisdom is just instruction. There are sayings of understanding. There are instructions in wise behavior. We get it. They're wise teachings that God gives. A few verses later, in verses 7 through 8, the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Again, what is wisdom here? Well, it's just instruction. It's the teaching from your father. It's the instruction from your mother. But quite quickly, wisdom becomes heavily personified in the very same chapter. Starting in 1:20, wisdom shouts in the street. She lifts her voice in the square at the head of the noisy streets. She cries out at the entrance of the gates in the city. She utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing, and fools hate my knowledge. Turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Notice, by the way, again, wisdom is closely associated with the words of God. Wisdom speaks forth God's words. What about in chapter 2? Chapter 2 says, make your ear attentive to wisdom. The parallel says, incline your heart to understanding. For if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as you would for hidden treasures, then you will discern the fear of Yahweh and discover the knowledge of God. For Yahweh gives wisdom from his mouth. Remember wisdom, words of God from the mouth. Come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. So again, we can see that God's wisdom is closely associated with the words of God. But then in chapter 3, we can see the personification of wisdom again. Move that. All right. How blessed is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding. For her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all of her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast. And then Yahweh, by wisdom, founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. So we could see wisdom being personified as something you should seek after and gain, and it means to seek after the wise teachings of God and to embrace them and to follow them. We can also see that wisdom is so important for you to acquire that God himself used wisdom as the personified agent to bring about creation. Yahweh, by wisdom, founded the earth, and you can see there that wisdom is not a conscious female alongside God because it's paralleled with God's understanding. What about chapter 8? Does not wisdom call and understanding lift up her voice? Besides the gates, she cries out, quote, pride and arrogance in the evil way, and the perverted mouth I hate. My fruit is better than gold, even pure gold, and my yield better than choicest silver. Then I was beside him as a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the world, his earth, and having my delight in the sons of men. So there's a heavy personification passage there in chapter 8 where wisdom does a lot of speaking in the first person. And then we see another one in the first 6 verses of chapter 9. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn out 7 pillars. She has prepared her bread. She has mixed her wine. Sounds like communion, by the way. She has also set her table. She has sent out her maidens. She's got some female servants. She calls from the top of the heights of the city, quote, whoever is naive, let him turn and hear. To him who lacks understanding, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine that I have mixed. Forsake your folly and live and proceed in the way of understanding. So the first 9 chapters of Proverbs, we get a sense that we have the wisdom of God. It's God's wise instruction. It's his ways that lead to understanding, but also it is heavily personified as a female figure, but it's not a conscious female alongside God. But then when you get to the very last chapter, chapter 31, we have this description of what's sometimes called the woman of strength, or a wife, or a woman of substance. It can be translated in a variety of ways. And what does it say about her? In Proverbs 31, starting in verse 10, a woman of substance who can find? Her worth is far above jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She looks for wool and flax and works with her hands in delight. She is like ships that bring profit. She brings her food from afar. She rises also while it is still night and gives bread to her household and portions to her maidens. She considers a field and buys it, and from the fruit of her earnings she plants a vineyard. The passage goes on. Her husband is known at the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies belts to the tradesmen. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the future. Now, if you read these passages in Hebrew, something very interesting is clear. We can see that this woman, this ideal wife, is the personification, the embodiment of personified wisdom. How do we know? Well, we've already seen that personified wisdom is more profitable than jewels. She offers good things. She hates evil things. She is full of delight. She brings forth profit. She offers bread. She's a homeowner. She works with maidens who serve her. She is bearing fruit. She is speaking at the city gates, and she is engaging in laughter. We read all of those passages. But guess what? The same Hebrew words, the very same Hebrew phrases are used to describe the ideal wife, the woman of substance. Guess what? She is more profitable than jewels. She offers good things. She hates evil things. She's full of delight, bringing forth profit, offering bread. She's a homeowner. She works with maidens who serve her. She bears fruit. She speaks at the city gates, and she is engaging in laughter. Anyone reading the Hebrew would see that the author is portraying this woman as the incarnation of personified wisdom 500 years before the Gospel of John was written. And if that wasn't enough, a little bit later in the passage, in 31 verse 27, the Hebrew verb that's actually used, which you would say in Hebrew as Sophia, is a bilingual pun for the Greek noun, Sophia. So the author knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to really clue you in onto this point, and a number of scholars have noticed this, as they should. Now, that's just my opinion, but modern scholarship is openly admitting that personified wisdom became incarnate in the woman of substance, as in the ideal female readers of Proverbs 31 who take wisdom's teachings and apply them to their life. So my former teacher, Leo Perdue, says in his commentary, the woman of substance becomes the human incarnation of what woman wisdom teaches. He goes on, he says that she is the incarnation of wisdom in female form. How about this commentary? The woman of substance is in some ways a real-life incarnation of woman wisdom. What about New Testament scholars? Ben Witherington III, another one of my former teachers. He said that this woman is indeed the very embodiment of wisdom. She is wisdom truly embodied. Incarnation began in the book of Proverbs. So that's our earliest occurrence of it, in 400 BC. What about 180? Well, we're going to look at a book called Sirach. And if you don't have an NRSV, you probably don't have this included in your Bible. I'm not suggesting it should be in your Bible. What is the book of Sirach? Well, Sirach is in the collection of the intertestamental Jewish literature that was included in the Greek Bible that we call the Septuagint. And Sirach, interestingly enough, shows clear signs of dependence upon the book of Proverbs, both in its structure and in its theology. And wisdom, the Greek noun Sophia, appears over 90 times in the book of Sirach. And so what we're going to see is that it's been strongly influenced by the portrayal of personified wisdom in Proverbs and arguably the incarnation of wisdom into human figures. Let me make my case. So in chapter 24 of Sirach, we have this long passage that talks about the personification of wisdom. So you can see very similar things to what we saw in Proverbs. Sirach 24, verse 1. Wisdom praises herself and tells of her glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High, she opens her mouth. Notice again, wisdom is closely associated with the mouth and the words of God. In the presence of his host, she tells of her glory. Quote, I came forth from the mouth of the Most High, again, closely associating wisdom with God's word, and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven and traversed the depths of the abyss, over the ways of the sea, over all the earth, and over every people and nation I have held sway. Among all these I sought a resting place, in whose territory should I abide? Then the creator of all things, someone distinguished from her, by the way, gave me a command, and my creator chose the place for my tent. He said, quote, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance. That's the voice of God. Before the ages, in the beginning, he created me, and for all the ages I shall not cease to be. In the holy tent I ministered before him, and so I was established in Zion. Thus, in the beloved city, he gave me a resting place, and in Jerusalem was my domain. I took root in an honored people, in the portion of the Lord, his heritage. I grew tall like a cedar in Lebanon, and like a cypress on the heights of Hermon. I grew tall like the palm tree in En-gedi, and like rose bushes in Jericho, like a fair olive tree in the field, and like a plane tree beside the water, I grew tall. Like cassia and camel's thorn, I gave forth perfume, and like choice myrrh, I spread my fragrance. The passage goes on, like the odor of the incense of the tent. This is personified wisdom, heavily, heavily personified, speaking in the first person, saying that she came out of heaven and was dwelling in the midst of Israel. And there's a lot of tree imagery. Didn't wisdom say that she was a tree of life? That's what's said about personified wisdom. But then at the end of the book of Sirach, we have this description of a historical high priest, Simon ben Onias, who was a high priest around the time that the book of Sirach was written. And this is what is said about this particular high priest. It says that the leader, this is Sirach chapter 50, verse 1, the leader of his brothers and the pride of his people was the high priest, Simon, son of Onias, who in his life repaired the house and in his life fortified the temple. How glorious he was, surrounded by the people, as he came out of the house of a curtain. Like roses in the day of first fruits, like lilies by a spring of water, like a green shoot on Lebanon on a summer day, like fire and incense in the censer, like a vessel of hammered gold, studded with all kinds of precious stones, like an olive tree laden with fruit, like a cypress towering in the clouds. When he put on his glorious robe and clothed himself with perfect splendor, when he went up to the holy altar, he made the court of the sanctuary glorious. When he received the portions from the hands of the priest, as he stood by the hearth of the altar with a garland of brothers around him, he was like a young cedar on Lebanon, surrounded by the trunks of palm trees. All the sons of Aaron in their splendor held the Lord's offering in their hands before the whole congregation of Israel, finishing the service at the altars and arranging the offering of the Most High, the Almighty. He held out his hands for the cup and poured a drink offering of the blood of the grape. He poured it out on the foot of the altar, and a pleasing odor to the Most High, the King of all. The passage goes on. Then Simon came down and raised his hands over the whole congregation of Israelites to pronounce the blessing of the Lord with his lips and to glory in his name. Now, just like Proverbs, if you read Sirach in Greek, you'll notice something very interesting about the depiction of Simon. You'll notice that earlier in chapter 24, personified wisdom is present in the people's midst. She is likened unto a rose bush. She's likened unto incense, like an olive tree, like a cypress tree, like a cedar tree, like a pleasing fragrance, and she is in possession of God's glory. Guess what? The very same Greek words are intentionally used to describe Simon, the historical high priest. He is present in the people's midst. He is likened unto a rose bush, like incense, an olive tree, a cypress tree, a cedar tree. He is like pleasing fragrance, and he's in possession of God's glory. Clearly, the author, just like the author of Proverbs 1 through 9 and 31, is portraying this historical high priest as the incarnation and the embodiment of God's personified wisdom, clearly being influenced by the book of Proverbs. And guess what? Modern scholarship openly admits that personified wisdom became incarnate in Simon ben Onias, as in a high priest from history. This is an actual real person that lived. All right? So, Crispin Fletcher Lewis says that she is incarnate in her avatar, Israel's high priest. Okay. Dr. Schmidt says that Ben Sira sees the high priest as one who transmits wisdom by his own embodiment of wisdom, the preeminent embodiment of wisdom in the world. And even in a commentary that came out just this year, which I was able to purchase, 2023, Dr. Wilson says that in performing his duties, the high priest essentially embodies wisdom. This is what scholars are saying about these passages. They're seeing incarnation in pre-Christian Judaism. All right, 2 down. Let's look at 100 BC. Here's where it gets a little bit fun. Now we're going to look at the Genesis Apocryphon, okay? This is a document out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? Now, just to be clear, we've looked at Proverbs, written in Hebrew. We've looked at Sirach, which it's now survived in a Greek source, and the Genesis Apocryphon is in Aramaic. Okay, so now we've got 3 languages. Now, what is the Genesis Apocryphon? It is a non-biblical scroll that retells the lives of these 3 figures, Lamech, Noah, and Abraham, and it's written in Aramaic. It was found in Cave 1 of the Qumran Caves, and it's also known by its shorter form, which is 1Q20. Okay, so I'm not going to just use Genesis Apocryphon, the entire thing. I'm just going to say 1Q20 from here on out. By the way, all the translations of this are my own. What is being said here? So we're going to focus on the retelling of the story of Abraham, which gives a lot of attention to someone named Sarah. So this is Abraham talking in this particular story. I, Abram, dreamt the dream on the night that I entered into Egypt. And in my dream, I saw a cedar tree and a palm tree. Some men arrived, intending to cut and uproot the cedar tree and to leave the palm tree by itself. But the palm tree shouted and said, "Do not cut down the cedar tree, for both of us are from a single root." And the cedar tree was saved thanks to the palm tree, and it was not cut down. Okay, so you get the story? See what happened? I woke up from my sleep at night, and I spoke to Sarah, my wife. I had a dream, and I am alarmed by this dream. She said to me, "Tell unto me your dream in order that I may know it." So I began to tell her the dream, and I told her the interpretation of the dream. Now catch this. I said, they wanted to kill me and leave you alone. Okay? So they wanted to cut down one tree, but the other tree shouted and said, don't do this, and the first tree was actually saved. So who is the person that saved whom? Sarah saved Abraham. But guess what it says in the book of Proverbs? Long life is in wisdom's right hand. In her left hand are riches and honors. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all of her paths are peace. And she is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who hold her fast. So in the book of Proverbs, we see that wisdom is one that offers life, is one that shows the path of peace, and is likened unto a tree. What do we see here? We see Sarah is offering life. She saves the life of Abraham. She offers the path of peace, and she's likened unto a tree. Maybe you're not convinced yet. That's okay. Let's look at another passage in 1Q20. As you're probably familiar with the story in Genesis, Sarah actually gets brought before a king, and in this retelling, the king actually tells us what he thinks about Sarah. This is what the king is saying. He says, "How pretty is the shape of her face. How lovely and how smooth is the hair on her head. How lovely are her eyes, how pleasant her nose, and all the blossom of her face. How lovely all her fair complexion. How beautiful are her arms, even her hands. How perfect. How alluring is the entire appearance of her hands. How pretty are the palms of her hands, her feet. How lovely. How perfect her thighs." I can't believe I had to translate that. Okay. "No virgin or wife who enters the bridal chamber is more beautiful than her," more beautiful than Sarah. Okay. "Her beauty stands out above all women. Her loveliness is far above them all." And notice this here. "And with all this beauty, in her is great wisdom." In Sarah is great wisdom. Now, what is said about personified wisdom in Proverbs? "How blessed the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding. Her profit is better than the profit of silver, and her gain better than fine gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire compares with her." Clearly, no woman you can desire would compare to Sarah. Maybe you're not convinced yet. Let me give you the final one. In the midst of the story, we see similar things like Abraham telling Sarah, "In every place that we go, say, 'He is my brother.'" Or a little bit later in the next chapter, "He wanted to kill me, but Sarah said to the king, 'He is my brother.'" And then the final one, which is the most important, "The king called to me and said to me, 'What have you done with me in regard to Sarah? You told me she is my sister when she is your wife.'" Okay, she is my sister. But guess what we see in the book of Proverbs? "Say to wisdom, you are my sister." But Abraham said, "You are my sister," to Sarah. What's going on there? What's going on in the Genesis Apocryphon? Well, guess what? Just like we saw in Proverbs, and just like we saw in Sirach, we see the incarnation of personified wisdom in Sarah, Abraham's wife. So here we got a lovely picture of these young, beautiful people. And according to the Genesis Apocryphon, Sarah is likened unto a tree that offers life. Sarah possesses immeasurable value, and Sarah is called my sister. When we look at Proverbs, personified wisdom is likened unto a tree that offers life. She possesses immeasurable value, and she is called my sister. Now, compared to biblical books like Proverbs or the intertestamental books like Sirach, the books in the Dead Sea Scrolls don't get as much scholarly attention. So modern scholars are just now beginning to give further attention to the concept of personified wisdom's incarnation and the figure of Sarah within the Genesis Apocryphon. In a more recent study, Dr. Lipscomb says that the Apocryphon redeems Sarah's reputation from Genesis 12 by recasting her as an embodiment of Lady Wisdom. And he goes on and he says that wisdom is not only personified, but embodied in the person of Sarah. And he quotes a study in his article from Craig Evans, who says that the beauty of Sarah is described at great length in the particular part of the Genesis Apocryphon, and he says it is a description possibly inspired in places by Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, where we looked at earlier, to where the ideal wife, the woman of substance, is the embodiment of wisdom. Scholars are seeing the concept of incarnation in pre-Christian Jewish sources. Maybe you're not convinced yet. Let's keep going. We looked at Proverbs, we looked at Sirach, we've looked at Genesis Apocryphon. Now we can move to the early portions of the first century. We can look at the figure of Philo Judaeus. It's not very easy to figure out exactly when he wrote, but it's likely that he wrote all of his works before the New Testament writings. Who is Philo? Well, Philo is a Greek-speaking Jew who wrote from Alexandria. He wrote 52 treatises in Greek, which actually makes him a more voluminous author than all the New Testament writers combined. This is why Philo is a very important person to study, even though most New Testament scholars kind of ignore him. Philo uses the noun wisdom. He writes in Greek, so he's going to use the noun Sophia over 200 times in his writings. And Philo regularly draws upon the theology of the book of Proverbs and Sirach. So we could see the influences upon Philo's depiction of wisdom. Let's begin with Philo. So, drawing on the theology of Proverbs, Philo personifies the wisdom of God as a female figure who plays the roles of a wife, a mother, a daughter of God, and a nurse. Here's a quote. The wisdom of God, which is the nurse and foster mother and educator of those who desire incorruptible food, for it, as the mother of those things which exist in the world, immediately supplies food to those beings which are brought forth by her. So clearly you can see wisdom being heavily personified as a variety of female figures. Okay? We can also see that wisdom functions as this personified agent through which God created all things, just like we saw in Proverbs. It's also there in Sirach. So in the next passage in the top right, your mother, wisdom, through whom the universe was completed. So the Father is the creator of all things, but God created through this personified female figure described as the mother. Shows up again. God being his father, Moses' father in the context, who is also the father of all things. Philo thought that God is the father of all things. And we have wisdom being his mother, Moses' mother, through whom the universe arrived at creation. So God, the Father, created all things, but God created all things through personified wisdom. And then we can see Philo equating the wisdom of God with the Word of God. He says that this river is generic goodness, and this issues forth out of Eden of the wisdom of God, and that is the Word of God. Wisdom, which is the Logos of God. So Philo just says, in the first century, God's wisdom is God's Word. Okay, we've already seen this in Proverbs. We've already seen this in Sirach. It's explicitly stated here by Philo. All right. Now, interestingly enough, Philo is going to portray Sarah as the embodiment of wisdom without any sort of seeming dependence on the Genesis Apocryphon. Sarah seems to be a really popular figure. So look at what is said about Sarah. It says, God also gives a share to Abraham of his own proper appellation, to whom, when he eradicated the pain from whom? You would think from Sarah, but actually, Philo says it's from wisdom. He gave rejoicing as an offspring. So here, he is just flat out saying, instead of saying Sarah, I'm just going to say wisdom because Philo thinks that wisdom has become incarnate in Sarah. He's just going to replace Sarah with wisdom. And he's going to do this for a variety of passages. He says, do you not see that dominant wisdom, which is Sarah, says, for whosoever shall hear it, shall laugh with me. And that's a quote from Genesis 21, verse 6. So here, he quotes a passage from Genesis, which talks about something that Sarah says, and he said, this is what dominant wisdom says. By the way, wisdom is Sarah. And then he says, the mother of Isaac is motherless wisdom. Well, who is Isaac's mother? It's Sarah. He goes and he says that Hagar is the handmaiden of, not Sarah, but wisdom, because wisdom has become incarnate in Sarah. He goes on, top right. And here we are to admire wisdom. She brought forth no child. This is obviously before she had her children. Okay? Next passage. At that time, he says, she shall bring forth a son to you, quote from Genesis 15, verse 10, and then he explains what the passage means. That is to say, wisdom shall bring forth joy. But Genesis 15, verse 10 is about Sarah. He's saying wisdom has become Sarah. God calls the names of wisdom and the wise man. So wisdom and the wise man are who? Sarah and Abraham. And then to mourn Sarah's death is to mourn for wisdom. Okay? It's a lot of reading through Philo to find these particular points. All right? But guess what? Sarah's not the only person in whom wisdom has become incarnate, according to Philo. We also have Rebekah. Two passages here. And so one passage tells of Rebekah's lineage, saying that she was born of Bethuel, which should be interpreted as the daughter of her God. And who is to be considered the daughter of God but wisdom, the firstborn mother of all things. So it's talking about Rebekah, and he's like, well, who is this? It's wisdom. In the next passage, he calls Bethuel the father of Rebekah. How then can the daughter of God, namely wisdom, be properly called a father? So here he seems to be describing Rebekah also as God's wisdom. And then we also have a passage that deals with Leah and Zipporah, but also it deals with Sarah and Rebekah. You have to read this very carefully. It says that it is plain that the lovers of wisdom, I want you to think, who are the lovers of wisdom, must repudiate the outward sense rather than choose it. For is not this quite natural? For the women who live with these men, the lovers of wisdom, the women who live with these men, the lovers of wisdom, are in fact, are in name indeed wives, but in fact virtues. Sarah is a princess and guide. Rebekah is perseverance in what is good. Leah, again, is virtue, fainting and weary at the long continuance of exertion, which every foolish man declines and avoids and repudiates. And Zipporah, the wife of Moses, is virtue. The passage talks about the lovers of wisdom. We know that's not just a generic way of talking about anyone who loves wisdom. It talks about the men who are married to these women. And then we learn that it's these four women. It's Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Zipporah. But really, they're wisdom, because Philo is depicting wisdom as becoming incarnate, and not just Sarah, not just Rebekah, but also Leah and Zipporah. Now, I could take all the time and I can show you the quotes from the Philo scholars, but I kind of felt like that's something I needed to cut from this. But I can assure you, this is dominant in Philo scholarship. The scholars of Philo have drawn attention to the incarnation of God's personified wisdom in the persons of Sarah, Rebekah, Leah, and Zipporah. Okay, so the paper will actually give you the specific page numbers if you want to chase up those places. So, we looked at 4 Jewish documents that predate Christianity, predate Christian documents. And what do we see? Having established that several Jewish writers incorporated the concept of incarnation in their pre-Christian writings, it is clear that the prologue is not the originator of the doctrine. Like, you are not the father of this doctrine. Okay? So even though scholars of the Gospel of John are saying, hey, nothing that's said about wisdom is even close to what's being said here, the evidence begs to differ. So the portrayal of the word / wisdom that became flesh in John 1:14 is deeply indebted to Judaism, demonstrating continuity between Judaism and early Christianity. So a question we might ask is, how might the prologue be interpreted if it too is firmly set within the context of Jewish speculation surrounding the incarnation of personified wisdom in noteworthy human beings? Under the assumption that the personified word in the prologue is a synonym for personified wisdom, what sort of wisdom influences might we find if we look for them in the prologue? How many do you think there are? Only 18 verses. How many could there be? 20. 20. But I bet before this presentation, you probably thought the answer was 0. We're not going to look at them all. We don't have enough time, but I have a summary slide. So John 1:1a, in the beginning was the Word, but Proverbs 8:23 says, ages ago, I, wisdom, was set up in the beginning, using the exact phrase, not just arche, but in arche. Wisdom was also in the beginning with God. Okay? Of course, the Word was with God in John 1:1, but wisdom has already said in Proverbs 8 that when he established the heavens, I, wisdom, was there. I was beside him. John 1:1c, which has the problem of translation you probably are aware of. I think it's the Word was fully expressive of God, but clearly wisdom is someone that expresses God. In Wisdom of Solomon, another intertestamental book, it says that for she, wisdom, is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Clearly wisdom, personified wisdom, fully expresses God. Okay? He was in the beginning with God. I do think that the prologue of John is personifying the Word, and so a pronoun is appropriate, okay? But clearly, wisdom has been personified in Proverbs 1:20. Wisdom is shouting in the streets. You know, she's like down there in the city, and she's calling out to people. What about John 1:3? All things were made through him. All things were made through this personified logos, and apart from him, not one thing was made. But look at what is said about wisdom in Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verses 1-2. A very important passage. Notice this. O God of my ancestors and Lord of mercy, who made all things according to your word, and by your wisdom you formed humankind. Notice God made all things by his word and by his wisdom. Word and wisdom are synonymous terms. Anyway, so we can go through, we can look at all these. In him was life. And of course, wisdom says long life was in her right hand. We've already seen that before. Here's a good one, John 1:5. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness could not overcome it. I think this is directly influenced by this particular passage in Wisdom 7:29-30. So compared to the light, she, wisdom, should just be wisdom, is found to be superior, for it is succeeded by the night, but against wisdom, evil does not prevail. So notice, against wisdom, evil does not prevail. Evil, by the way, described as darkness. What do we see in the prologue? The light shines in the darkness, but darkness could not overcome it. Okay? Many scholars see that John 1:5 is directly drawing upon wisdom chapter 7. I'm still doing good on time. I think we can go through quite a bit of these. We can see the personified word was in the world didn't know him. He came to his own, but his own did not receive him. There's a sense of rejection. Well, was wisdom ever rejected? Proverbs 1, because I, wisdom, called and you refused. I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. You neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. Wisdom was also rejected. But as many as receive the embodied word, to them he gave the right to become children of God. They received the right to become children of God. But look, in Sirach, my child, from your youth, choose discipline, and when you have gray hair, you will still find wisdom. So those who receive wisdom are called children. Those that receive the word are called children. Even to those who believe in his name, belief is the proper response to interacting with the embodied word. And guess what? If they continue believing, they will inherit her. They will inherit wisdom. Believing is the proper response to accepting wisdom. Of course, we've seen in John 1:14, the word became flesh. We saw this, of course, that wisdom became incarnate in the obedient women of Proverbs, in the historical high priest Simon ben Onias, in Sarah, according to Genesis Apocryphon, and Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Zipporah in Philo. Okay, so again, John is not saying anything new. He's just saying, actually, wisdom is now embodied in the human Messiah. What else? Okay. And John 1:14 pitched his tent among us. We read this in Sirach. Then the creator of all things gave me wisdom of command, and my creator chose a place for my tent. He said, make your dwelling in Jacob. So the word becomes flesh and pitches its tent in the world. Well, 200 years earlier, Sirach had said that wisdom pitched her tent in the world. All right. And we beheld his glory. And then guess what? Proverbs 8 says that riches and glory are with me. It uses kavod in Hebrew, and it uses doxa in the Septuagint. So wisdom has glory. How about this one? Glory of the unique one. You might translate it as only begotten. That's irrelevant. The point is that it has the adjective monogenes. So the embodied word is this monogenes from the Father, but that was already said of personified wisdom earlier in Wisdom chapter 7, verse 22. Wisdom, the fashioner of all things, taught me there is in her a spirit that is intelligent, holy, and unique. The adjective monogenes in Greek. Okay. We're running short on time, so I'm just going to kind of skip ahead to my summary slide. The point here is that in the Gospel of John, what do we learn about the Logos? 20 things. The Logos was in the beginning. The Logos was with God. The Logos fully expresses God. The Logos is personified. It's the agent of creation. It had life in itself. It brings light to darkness. It was rejected. It is received by God's children. It results in belief. It became flesh. It dwelt among the people. It reveals God's glory. It's unique. It uses the adjective monogenes. It brings grace. It brings truth. It's associated with fullness and filling. It thinks favorably about the law of Moses. It has an intimate relationship with God, and it reveals God. But guess what? All 20 of those things were already said about personified wisdom in Jewish sources. Wisdom was in the beginning. It was with God. It fully expresses God. Wisdom is personified. Wisdom is the agent of creation. It had life in itself. Wisdom brings light to darkness. It was rejected. It is received by God's children, resulting in belief. It became flesh. It dwelt among the people. It revealed God's glory. It's called the monogenes, the unique one. It brings grace and truth. It's associated with fullness. It thinks favorably about the law of Moses, and it has an intimate relationship with God, and it reveals God. So I believe that I've demonstrated that the concept of incarnation was in pre-Christian Jewish sources, and the Gospel of John is dependent on this Jewish doctrine. It's not doing something brand new. The newest thing that it's doing is that it's saying that Jesus is the now climactic and final place in which wisdom or word has become incarnate. Thank you. Under time also, by the way. Okay, 130 slides. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for bringing these scholarly insights to light and for the wonderful slides and for staying under time. I mean, you're on everybody's Christmas list this year. If you celebrate that sort of thing, if you don't, please don't shoot me. A few questions have emerged for you.
I imagine.
And I'm going to combine a couple of them here in this first question. And there's been some questions around the connection that you make between Logos and Sophia.
Yeah.
And so some of our questions are related to how it is that you're doing that. I think in your final slides you were relating them perhaps conceptually, but terminologically there's been some questions about that. For example, why do you think that the author chooses Logos instead of Sophia?
Sure.
And then also there's been additional questions about maybe some scholarly sources that may also be making that terminological connection as well.
Yeah, okay, so I think you gave me 3 questions there.
I thought it was 2.
You gave me 3. Okay.
3 and 1, maybe.
Well, I heard, okay, yeah.
So 2.
Okay, so we noticed in Proverbs, and I pointed out that God's wisdom associated with the instruction that comes forth from God's mouth. Clearly there's an association with God's wise teachings, which of course are God's wise words. That much is quite clear. We also know from Proverbs 3:19 that Yahweh created the world through wisdom. We know from Psalm 33:6, Yahweh created the world through his word. Okay? We know that God creates the world through his word. In Genesis 1:3, Vayomer Elohim, Yahi Or, God said, let there be light. Okay? And then Psalm 104, verse 24, it says, "Oh Yahweh, how great are your works! With wisdom you have made them all." Okay, so the Old Testament says that God made the world through his word, and God made the world through his wisdom. That's an Old Testament teaching. You don't need any of these things to get that particular point. Okay? We know that Sirach says that wisdom says, hey, wisdom, came out of the mouth of God. That's close association with wisdom and word out of wisdom's own mouth, unintended. Okay? And we saw that Philo says the wisdom of God is the Logos of God. Okay? And then I demonstrated that the things that are said about the word in the prologue, almost all of them have parallels with wisdom. Basically everything except for the John the Baptist stuff, which you wouldn't expect to have that sort of parallel. Now, the modern commentaries on the Gospel of John will point this out. This is not an uncommon thing. This is pretty much a consensus at this point in the 21st century. So I would just encourage people to look at some good modern commentaries, and I think this is a widely recognized point. I might have missed one particular question.
I think you've covered it.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. Our next question is this. Is wisdom portrayed as a created hypostasis or person in this Jewish intertestamental works or in Philo, for example?
Yeah, so a hypostasis that seems to be drawing on language from like the 4th and 5th century. So I think incorporating that into Second Temple Judaism would be historically anachronistic. Okay, so I don't think it's there. Now what we see here is we have, again, the influence of the original document being Proverbs, okay, where clearly there's a personification. That's the dominant hypothesis with Proverbs scholars. And then we just continue to see that sort of language that's being used there. Okay, we can see that wisdom in these books will just be described as a parallel to God's instruction, God's wise teaching in the normal, non-personified way. And then when it gets personified, it's just a female figure because Chokmah, the noun for wisdom in Hebrew, is feminine, so it gets personified as a female figure. And Sophia, the noun in Greek, is feminine, so it's going to be personified as a female figure as well. So I don't think that we're going to see a second person, per se. I mean, there's a big difference between a personification and a person. You know, when we read at the end of Psalm 23 that goodness and mercy are going to follow me all the days of my life, it's like, goodness and mercy are following me, they're going to be behind me. These are God's mercy and God's goodness are personified into these things that are following me. But no one thinks that those are actual male figures that are there. That's what personification is. And so I think if we follow that, we could see how that works. We don't see until, I think, the 2nd century AD when the readers are saying that wisdom actually isn't a personification. Wisdom actually is a conscious person. We definitely start to see that in Justin Martyr. But prior to that, like Clement of Rome and the Didache, wisdom is still this personified attribute of God's wise interaction with the world. So I know that for some people who have a belief in preexistence, that might be a contentious issue, but I don't think that you're going to find scholars that are saying that God's wisdom is an actual female figure up there in heaven, so now there's 2 figures up there.
What would you say about Philo's treatment of the angel of the Lord? In some understandings, this seems to be some kind of instantiation of God's power or some of his attributes. How would you relate that sort of a conception in Philo to how he treats this incarnation of wisdom? Is there any relationship between those ideas?
You know, there's a sense where like the angel of the Lord is not really relevant to my topic, so I don't really feel like I can say authoritatively on that particular thing. But as I pointed out, that wisdom, of course, is quite popular in Philo. He uses it 200 times, which compared to Sirach is only 90 times. But it is true that Philo is going to talk about the logos far more frequently than the word. Okay, Philo definitely has a negative view of women. Okay, he's very sexist, and a lot of scholars have pointed that out. So he's going to spend a lot more time talking about word because he doesn't want to say a whole lot of things about wisdom. But I don't really know if I'm qualified to give an answer on the. I mean, we'd have to look. We could sit down and look at a passage, but I don't. There's a sense where like the angel Lord is not really relevant to my study.
Sure, thank you. Our next question is this: what is the difference between possessing wisdom and embodying wisdom?
I think if the Word became flesh, or if wisdom became flesh, that's not just saying that Jesus possessed it. It says that this became this. Or, I mean, as we saw in Philo, like, wisdom is Sarah. Not just Sarah possessed wisdom is Sarah. That sort of thing. So, I think, there's one thing like having something and being something. I think there's a pretty clear difference between having those things. I mean, I can have some coffee right here. It doesn't mean that I am coffee. I think we all recognize the difference between those particular things. But I think if we look at the evidence pretty clearly, and we see what these authors are doing by taking all of these descriptions of wisdom, of personified wisdom, and then just saying that's what a real person is, whether it's an ideal wife or a real high priest or these various female figures, the wives of the patriarchs, I think they're demonstrating incarnation. And again, this is not just me saying it. I gave references to 12 different scholars that are saying this. So this is what a lot of scholars are saying at this point.
Thank you. Are the insights you presented compatible with the Socinian reading of John 1?
I don't know what the Socinian reading of John is. Is that the New Greek?
That's where the word refers to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, as opposed to.
Yeah, I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced of that because I think the wisdom parallels make it quite clear that this is referring to in the beginning being the Genesis creation. I mean, and I know not everyone agrees on this, but I think when the prologue begins by saying, in the beginning, there is this personified attribute through which God created all things, and it brought about light and life, I think that's obviously referring to Genesis chapter 1. To ignore all that and say it's not referring to that, I just don't think that's the best reading. I'm not convinced of another reading of that. And again, if I'm right with the wisdom parallels, it has to refer to creation. Okay.
Sure. And here's a question that has now rolled in, which I think asks what I asked earlier in a slightly different and perhaps better way.
Sure.
How much ontological oomph is consistent among the sources referenced? Is wisdom consistently empty of ontological reality? Or do some of these authors, such as Philo, see wisdom as a sort of emanation that's more than a concept?
Yeah, so Philo is, I'm just going to be honest, Philo contradicts himself. Sometimes Philo will say that word and wisdom are the same. Sometimes Philo will say that wisdom was first and out of wisdom came the logos. Sometimes Philo will say it the other way around. Sometimes he'll say the logos was first and out of the logos came wisdom. But I'm just going to be honest, like Philo is just, he's inconsistent at times, okay? It's hard to systematize him because he's just inconsistent, okay? And you write as much as he does and see if you're going to be inconsistent over that particular time. I mean, this is a Greek-speaking Jew that's trying to understand the law of Moses through a Greek-speaking mind. He's doing the best that he can with that, and again, he wrote more than all the New Testament writers combined. He's a difficult writer to grasp and to get a hold of. I mean, I'm not an expert in him. I've tried to understand him as best as I can, and I've read all of his references to wisdom and try to put them in their context. And as you read the passages, he's not easy to read. He's not fun.
Right.
So,
and he's also been described as a mystic by many scholars, so that categorization might be helpful for some.
Yeah. I mean, he's
what
philosophical.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question. So this question relates to the Holy Spirit in the Christian era. So is it fair to say that in a similar way that wisdom becomes incarnate, if you will, in the person of Christ? Is there any similarity to how the Holy Spirit now dwells in believers?
Yes. There. I can't say just yet, but there's a lot of interesting work on the close association. They're not identified as the same thing, but there's a close association between the wisdom of God and how the wisdom interacts with the Spirit. We always saw this in Proverbs 1. Wisdom says, I will pour out my Spirit. There's a sense where wisdom gives the Spirit. Well, who gives the Spirit at the end of the Gospel of John? It's Jesus, the embodiment of wisdom. So there's a lot of close connections with that, and there's more to that question than I think people realize, but I can't quite reveal.
Excellent.
Everything just
Thank
yet.
you. And we have one final comment,
Sure.
which I think might be a fair summary of your presentation, your proposal.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear if you think this is an accurate encapsulation.
Sure.
The Orthodox think incarnation is a literal, non-physical person becoming a physical person. You are talking about a non-literal incarnation. A personification comes to be in a real, literal person.
My sense is that the Orthodox group understands incarnation as the conscious second member of the Trinity becoming human and maintaining all of his divinity. But that's a real conscious person becoming man. Here we're having a personification becoming human. But the thing is, the Orthodox people, they don't get to define incarnation. The pre-Christian Jewish sources get to define incarnation. Don't let them steal that definition from us, okay? Start with the Jewish people, okay? And by the way, many of the New Testament writers will also portray Jesus in terms of God's wisdom. I mean, that was going on for 60 years prior to the writing of the Gospel of John. I mean, that was Matthew, Luke, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, Hebrews, 1 John. I mean, it's all over the New Testament prior to the writing of the Gospel of John. So don't let them steal that definition from us, okay? It was Jewish, and it was the incarnation of a personification, not a conscious female person. If so, then Jesus is not the pre-incarnate Son. He is a pre-incarnate female figure, okay? So if you think that wisdom is an actual female person, you don't believe in the pre-incarnate Son. You believe in the pre-incarnate female figure. So, okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr.
Good.
Smith. Let's
Okay.
give him a round of
All right.
applause.
Thank you.